The scent of his own absolute ruin bled through the steel doors of the private elevator long before they even opened. Silas stood frozen by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse. Rain lashed against the glass. Thunder rattled the bones of the city below. Yet, the only storm he cared about was the sudden, violent thrashing of his inner wolf. Driven by that scent, his claws threatened to break through his skin. It was a chaotic mix of cheap diner grease, stale rain, and pure, unadulterated terror. But beneath all that grime, there was a dark, intoxicating sweetness. It smelled like wild honey and impending disaster. Why was his pulse hammering like a fresh pup on his first hunt? He was the Alpha King. He owned these streets. He owned the banks. In fact, he owned the very building he stood in. He had bought this specific syndicate debt just as a power play against the High Council. The old gambler owed $3 million, offering his only daughter to clear the ledger. Silas despised the flesh trade. He only accepted the contract because he needed to keep the council blind to his true moves. He planned to toss the girl a stack of cash and a fake passport, sending her far away from the monsters in this city. Without warning, the elevator chimed. The heavy steel doors slid open. Silas turned around slowly. He expected a weeping, fragile victim, a broken girl begging for her life. Instead, the figure who stepped onto his imported marble floor made the air suck out of his lungs. She was drenched. Her cheap waitress uniform clung to her shivering frame. A heavy, suffocating silence descended on the massive room. Her heartbeat was a frantic, erratic drum against his highly sensitive ears. Bam, bam, bam. She was absolutely terrified. Even so, she didn't look down. Her eyes locked onto his, burning with a desperate, wild fire. She lifted her chin, daring the monster to strike. As if pulled by a string, Silas took a slow step forward. The beast inside his chest roared, throwing itself against his ribs. Mine. The word echoed in his skull. It was impossible. He hadn't felt this pull. Not since the night of the bloody massacre 10 years ago. The night the council framed him for a murder he didn't commit. The night that changed everything. He pushed the ghost of that memory away. He couldn't afford distractions. He had to find the real killers. He had to protect his pack. He had to keep his walls up. Harper, Silas said. His voice was a low, rumbling growl that vibrated through the floorboards. She flinched. Just a tiny twitch of her shoulders, but her scent spiked with fresh panic. "You know my name," she whispered. Her voice trembled, but she forced the words out. "I know everything about the things I own." He wanted to sound cold. He wanted to sound like the ruthless billionaire the world thought he was, but the words tasted like ash in his mouth. The air between them seemed to shrink. He could hear the shallow, rapid hitch of her breath. He could see the faint blue veins pulsing in her neck. Every single instinct screamed at him to close the distance, to touch her, to taste the rain on her skin. He clenched his fists inside his tailored pockets. The control he spent a decade building was cracking, and she hadn't even taken a second step. The stillness shattered when she finally moved. Harper walked further into the sterile, quiet penthouse. Her wet sneakers squeaked against the polished stone, a pathetic, small sound. But then, she stopped right in the center of his living room, surrounded by millions of dollars of art and leather. She looked completely out of place. She looked perfect. "My father owes you $3 million, she stated. Her voice was stronger now. Silas crossed his arms over his broad chest. "He does. And I am the payment. You are the collateral," Silas corrected softly. His golden eyes tracked a single drop of water rolling down her pale neck, vanishing into the collar of her ugly shirt. His wolf whined, scratching at his mind. He stayed by the window to keep his distance. Yet the smell of rain and fire clouded his thoughts, and the dark defiance in her eyes utterly captivated him. "Collateral means you hold me until he pays," Harper said. A bitter, sharp laugh escaped her lips. "He's never going to pay. We both know that. So, let's skip the games, Alpha." Silas narrowed his eyes. "What games?" Acting on pure nerve, she took a step toward him. The part where you pretend you aren't a monster. The part where I pretend I have a choice. I know what happens to Omegas sold to the Syndicate. Her scent shifted. The fear was still there, heavy and thick, but now it was mixed with a strange, calculated resolve. She was planning something. Silas could practically hear the gears turning in her head. "You know nothing about me," Silas growled low. "I know you bought me," she fired back. Her hands curled into tight fists at her sides. "I know I can't leave. So, I will pay the debt." Silas let out a dark, dry chuckle. "You don't have $3 million, little bird. I have me." The words hung in the air. Time stood still. He stared at her, completely stunned. She was offering herself to him, not as a captive, but as a transaction. It was a business deal. She wanted to use her body to erase the ledger. His blood ran cold, then boiled white-hot. He wanted to protect her. He wanted to ruin her. He wanted to wrap her in silk and hide her away from the world forever. "You think one night with you is worth $3 million?" he mocked. He needed to push her away before he did something crazy. She didn't back down. Closing the final gap between them, she stopped just inches from his chest. The heat radiating off her small body was like a furnace. "I think," she whispered, looking up through thick, wet lashes, "that by the time the sun comes up, you'll consider the debt completely settled." As if summoned, the mating bond flared to life. It wasn't a spark. It was a raging, violent wildfire. The heavy scent of her arousal hit his senses, blinding him. The rational part of his brain, the CEO, the king, the strategist, simply shut down. His wolf took the wheel. Silas reached out, his large, rough hand wrapping around the back of her neck. He felt her pulse jump wildly against his palm and pulled her flush against his solid chest. She gasped, a soft, breathy sound that went straight to his groin. "Show me," he commanded, his voice barely a rasp. The remaining restraint burned into ash. Silas didn't walk her to the bedroom. He carried her. He kicked the heavy oak door to his master suite, shut with a deafening slam, dropping her onto the center of his massive black silk bed. "You shouldn't have offered," he muttered, his face buried in the crook of her neck. He breathed in deeply. "Lavender, rain, honey, I pay my debts," she choked out softly. He kissed her. It wasn't gentle. It was a hungry, desperate collision of teeth and heat. She tasted like cheap coffee and something utterly intoxicating. She kissed him back with a sudden, shocking ferocity, her small hands grabbing his shirt and pulling him closer. The wolf howled in total victory, the sheer, overwhelming power of the sudden bond blinding him to everything outside the four walls of his suite. "Is secret." A sudden, sharp drop in temperature pierced the room. Silas snapped his eyes open. It was dark. The storm had passed, leaving pale moonlight spilling across the floor. He reached out his arm. The sheets were completely cold. "Harper?" he grunted, his voice thick with sleep. Silence. He sat up fast. Her scent was fading, drifting toward the cracked bedroom door. Panic, cold and sharp, gripped his chest. He swung his legs over the edge, and as his bare feet hit the floor, his golden eyes caught a flashing red light from his private study across the hall. "No." Silas rushed out of the suite, throwing the study doors wide open. The heavy steel door of his biometric wall safe stood ajar. The green light blinked steadily, mocking him. Because she had touched him, she captured his fingerprints. Because he let the bond blind him, he didn't hear her slip away. He stared into the empty vault. The encrypted flash drive containing the forensic files, his only leverage against the High Council, was gone. She hadn't just run away. She had stolen his darkest secret. A low, terrifying snarl built deep in his chest. It ripped from his throat, shaking the glass windows of the penthouse. The hunt had begun. The roar shattered the remaining glass of the study, sending a shower of jagged rain down onto the city streets hundreds of feet below. Silas didn't blink. He tore the heavy steel safe door entirely off its hinges, hurling it across the room. It smashed into the mahogany desk, splintering the expensive wood into 1,000 jagged pieces. Gone. She had played him. A desperate waitress outmaneuvering the king. He stood breathing heavily in the wreckage, his bones ground together, aching with the primal urge to shift. The CEO was dead. The Alpha had taken the reins. He bypassed the phone and the lockdown protocols. Instead, he stripped off the ruined remnants of his shirt. Cold wind whipped through the broken window, biting his hot skin. He inhaled. Beneath the sting of ionized air and ozone, her scent lingered a faint ribbon of wild honey and rain. Silas vaulted out the window. He plummeted into the storm, catching the adjacent fire escape. His claws extended, shredding the metal grating, to slow his descent before hitting the wet alleyway pavement in a three-point crouch. The concrete cracked. The hunt began. He moved through the shadows, the neon signs of the inner city bleeding into the grimy, flickering streetlights of the outskirts. The rain fell harder, desperately trying to wash her away. Yet the mating bond throbbed against his ribs like a physical beacon, an invisible leash pulling him through the dark. She couldn't hide. He tracked her scent past overflowing dumpsters, his mind racing with a toxic mixture of murderous rage and sickening panic. She didn't just steal a flash drive. She stole a live grenade. If the High Council caught wind of that data, they wouldn't just kill her, they would tear her apart. The rogue lands reeked of sour whiskey and unwashed desperation. By the time Silas crossed into the lawless sector, his skin hummed with lethal energy. This was no place for a fragile human. Her scent grew thicker, leading him straight toward the underground market. Rogue stepped out of his path as he stalked down the flooded street, backing into the shadows at the sight of the blood on his knuckles. Then, the realization hit him. The broker den. She thought she held Syndicate financial records, a ticket to a new life. She had no idea she was holding a radioactive beacon. If a black market hacker plugged that drive into an unshielded network, the Council's decryption traps would trigger. A sharp, high-pitched electronic whine pierced the heavy night air. Only a wolf could hear it. It emanated from an abandoned subway station 3 blocks away. Someone had just breached the first firewall. The signal was live. He broke into a dead sprint, tearing through a chain-link fence as the metal snapped against his chest. The scent of gunpowder and ozone flooded the wind. Council hitmen, 4 tactical SUVs, were already parked haphazardly on the curb above the subway entrance. Heavily armed mercenaries swarmed down the concrete stairs. He had to bathe the tunnels in blood. The underground den was a nightmare of flashing red strobes and screaming sirens. Silas bypassed the stairs, plunging down the massive ventilation shaft and landing on the roof of a rusted subway car with a deafening crash. Black market dealers scattered below. Silas only saw Harper. She was backed against a concrete pillar, face pale, hands empty. 3 council hitmen in tactical gear had her surrounded. One raised a heavy, silver-plated pistol to her forehead. Silas launched himself off the train car. He slammed into the first hitman before the trigger could be pulled, crushing the mercenary's chestplate and snapping his arm. The other 2 spun. Silas lunged, grabbing the second man by the throat and hurling him into a brick wall. The third man fired. A silver bullet grazed Silas's shoulder, burning like hot acid. He didn't slow down, closing the distance and driving his fist into the mercenary's jaw. Silence fell over the platform. Silver-laced blood dripped from Silas's torn shoulder, hissing against the damp concrete. He turned his glowing eyes toward Harper. She trembled against the pillar, looking at the carnage, then up at him. Terrified, he stalked toward her. Every instinct demanded he punish her for running, but as he looked down into her wide, panicked eyes, the anger evaporated. All that remained was the agonizing need to keep her breathing. "You stupid, reckless little bird," he rasped. He grabbed her arm. Not gentle, but an anchor. The wail of police sirens pierced the tunnels. Dozens of heavily armed officers stormed down the escalators. There was no time to argue, no time to find the drive. Silas pulled her hard against his side, dragging her into the pitch-black maze of the subway tunnels, as the world closed in behind them. The tunnels swallowed them. Silas ran blind, navigating by scent and memory. He kept his grip firm on Harper's arm, pulling her along the rusted maintenance tracks. She stumbled twice in the dark. She didn't cry out. She just scrambled back to her feet, her breathing harsh against the damp walls. The silver bullet lodged in his shoulder was a dead weight of toxic heat. It wasn't a clean through and through. The metal was melting into his muscle tissue, sending lines of poison down his left arm. His healing factor fought it, but it was losing ground. He kicked out a heavy iron drainage grate. They spilled out into a concrete spillway miles from the inner city. The storm still raged, masking their scent from the tracker drones swarming the skyline. Silas spotted a rusted sedan parked behind an abandoned auto shop. He ripped the driver's side door open, snapping the steering column casing. He twisted the wires. The engine sputtered to life. "Get in," he rasped. Harper slid into the passenger seat, pressing herself against the far door. Silas threw the car into gear. They sped into the empty stretches of the outer rogue territories. The cabin was utterly silent, save for the rhythmic thud of the wipers and the wet drip of black blood soaking his ruined shirt. He glanced at her. Her knees were pulled to her chest. She stared out the window at the blurred neon signs. Her jaw set. She wasn't acting like prey anymore. She was calculating. The Starlight Motel was a decaying concrete block on the edge of the Syndicate boundary. Silas kicked the door of room 4 shut. It smelled of damp ash and rot. He dragged a heavy oak dresser across the stained carpet, barricading the entrance. His vision swam. The silver was spreading. He leaned against the peeling wallpaper, locking his golden eyes on Harper. She stood near the sagging mattress, her wet clothes dripping onto the floor. "Where is it?" His breathing was too shallow. "Where is what?" Her voice was entirely too steady. "The decryption key. The micro SD." Silas pushed off the wall. "I know you didn't leave it in the tunnels. Hand it over, Harper. Now." She lifted her chin. The scent of her fear spiked, but beneath it was a bedrock of pure stubbornness. "No." Silas let out a low rumble. "You have no idea what you're holding. That drive is a death sentence. The council will level this entire city block to get it back." "Then let them," she shot back. "It's the only leverage I have left." He closed the distance in 2 strides, backing her up against the cheap laminate of the nightstand. "Give it to me." "I can't." She stared straight up into his glowing eyes. "I swallowed it." Silas froze. He stared at the delicate column of her throat. He listened to the rapid thud of her pulse. She was telling the truth. She had ingested the microscopic key to his exoneration. A dry laugh cracked his chest. He couldn't cut it out of her. He couldn't force it. He was the most feared alpha in the territory, and he was neutralized by a waitress who refused to break. The room spun. Silas grabbed the edge of the nightstand, his knees buckling under the weight of the silver poison. The bathroom was a tight box of cracked yellow tiles. Silas sat on the edge of the porcelain tub, head resting against the damp wall. The wound on his shoulder was a jagged crater. Blackened veins crawled up his neck. He needed to dig the bullet out, but his hands shook violently from the neurotoxin. A shadow fell across the doorway. Harper stood there holding a threadbare towel and a small bottle of rubbing alcohol. "Go away," he grunted, closing his eyes. "You're dying," she said. "I'm a lichen. I don't die easily." "You're bleeding black." She stepped into the bathroom. The space instantly felt too small. The heat of her skin spiked the bond beneath his fever. She knelt on the tiles between his spread knees. Silas tensed. "Don't touch me." She ignored the warning. She uncapped the alcohol. "Hold still." When she pressed the soaked towel to his torn flesh, the pain was blinding. Silas roared, a savage sound that rattled the light fixture. His hand shot out, wrapping around her throat. He didn't squeeze. He just held her there, his chest heaving, his wolf fighting the instinct to tear apart the source of the pain. Harper didn't flinch. Her dark eyes looked up at him. She didn't fight his grip. Her scent shifted. The terror vanished, replaced by a soft, warm undercurrent that smelled like empathy. "Let me help you," she whispered. Silas slowly opened his hand, letting his fingers slide down her neck to rest on her collarbone. The touch was electric. The pain receded, drowned out by the heavy weight of his obsession with her. He leaned forward, close enough to taste the rain on her jaw. He could hear her heart skipping a beat. A short, electronic chirp cut through the silence. Silas snapped his head toward the bedroom. The perimeter motion sensor he had placed by the window was flashing red. They had been found. The red light blinked. Once. Twice. Silas shoved off the tub. His muscles tore against the silver invading his veins. The alpha overrode the shock. "Stay in the tub," he ordered. He stalked into the bedroom, shoving the heavy dresser away from the door with his good arm. The storm outside was deafening. He stepped onto the motel walkway. 3 rogues stood in the flooded parking lot. Cheap, expendable mercenaries. They carried rusted machetes and silver-loaded shotguns. They caught her scent through the cracked door. Silas didn't give them time to raise their weapons. He vaulted the rusted railing. He hit the pavement in front of the leader, driving a fist straight through the man's ribs. The second rogue fired. Silver buckshot shredded Silas's left thigh. He didn't break stride. He pivoted, grabbing the hot barrel of the shotgun, crushing the metal before ripping the rogue's throat out. The third turned to run. Silas caught his collar, slamming his skull into the concrete until movement ceased. Silence returned. Silas stood in a pool of dirty water. The silver in his thigh merged with the poison in his shoulder. His knees gave out. He dragged himself up the concrete stairs, leaving a thick, black smear against the peeling paint. He breached room 4. He locked the door. 2 steps later, the darkness swallowed him. He woke to the taste of copper and ozone. Fever baked his skin. Every breath scraped his throat. Silas cracked his heavy eyelids. The room was swallowed in shadows, save for the harsh glare of a cracked burner phone casting long shapes against the wall. Harper sat on the floor near his head. She held the phone in shaking hands. Beside her knee, the micro SD adapter lay on the carpet. She hadn't swallowed it. She had hidden it. Silas tried to move, to snatch the device, but his arms were dead weight. The silver paralyzed his upper body. He was helpless, pinned to the cheap laminate flooring, watching a waitress read his execution warrant. He waited for the scent of triumph. He waited for her to realize she held the ultimate leverage. Instead, a tear cut through the grime on her cheek. Her scent hit him a crushing wave of absolute devastation. No victory, only raw, jagged grief. She wasn't looking at financial ledgers. She swiped to the next file, breath-hitching. Silas recognized the blurry crime scene photos reflecting in her dark eyes, the blood on the floorboards, her mother's face, the forensic report burying the counsel's blade under his name. She lowered the phone. She looked down at him. "They killed her," she whispered. Her voice was hollow. "You've been hunting them." The silence weighed heavier than the damp heat. Silas braced himself. He expected her to back away. He was the monster who failed to save her mother, the catalyst for his entire violent empire. His throat clamped tight. Words failed him. Harper set the phone face down. She didn't run. She shifted closer, pulling the blood-soaked towel from his chest. "You let me hate you," she said softly. She dipped a clean corner into the alcohol bottle. Her hands were completely steady. She began to wipe the blackened blood from his shredded thigh. The shift in the room was absolute. The walls of his billionaire fortress, the unyielding dominance of the alpha, it all dissolved into the stained floorboards. She wasn't a captive paying a debt. He wasn't a king collecting collateral. They were just 2 bleeding people in a locked room. Silas let his head fall back. He closed his eyes, surrendering to the sting of the alcohol and the impossibly gentle slide of her fingers against his skin. He allowed himself to be weak. Then, the burner phone emitted a sharp, continuous chirp. His eyes snapped open. Adrenaline pierced the paralysis. "The decryption signal," he rasped, forcing himself up onto one elbow. Harper looked at the screen. A red proximity warning flashed over the data files. "They tracked the network ping," Silas said, pushing through the agony in his leg. "The council knows exactly where we are." He looked at the window. The rain was stopping. They had less than 20 minutes before an army leveled the building. "We have to move," Silas rasped. He didn't wait for his muscles to agree. He forced himself off the stained carpet, utilizing his good arm to grip the edge of the nightstand. The silver in his thigh tore at his muscle fibers, sending a fresh wave of toxic heat straight to his brain. He bit back a groan. Tires screeched in the distance. The council vanguard was already closing the perimeter. Harper didn't freeze. She scooped the micro SD from the floor, shoved the burner phone into her back pocket, and moved to his side. She ducked under his uninjured arm, wrapping her small hands around his waist to bear his weight. "Back window," she said. They shattered the frosted glass of the tiny bathroom, spilling out into the dark, trash-filled alley behind the motel, just as heavy boots kicked the front door of room 4 off its hinges. Silas let Harper guide him. They moved blindly through the rain-slicked labyrinth of the rogue sector. His vision narrowed to the immediate space around them, the smell of wet asphalt, the erratic thump of her heart against his ribs, the agonizing drag of his left leg. They broke through a rusted chain-link fence surrounding an abandoned, half-constructed corporate high-rise. It was a graveyard of exposed steel girders and poured concrete, stretching 60 stories into the smog. "Up," Silas grunted, pointing toward the skeletal stairwell. "Signal interference. Need altitude for an extraction ping." The climb was absolute torture. Every flight of concrete stairs drained the last reserves of his alpha strength. By the 40th floor, his blood was leaving a thick black trail on the steps. By the 50th, he was operating purely on the savage instinct to keep her out of the council's hands. They collapsed on the 60th floor. There were no walls yet, just open air, violent wind, and a sprawling view of the city's glowing grid below. Silas slid down a concrete pillar, his breathing ragged and wet. He pulled his encrypted Syndicate comms device from his pocket, hitting the emergency distress frequency. A small, warm hand touched his bloody knuckles. He looked up. Harper knelt beside him. She opened his fist and pressed the tiny micro SD card directly into his palm. She didn't bargain. She didn't ask for her freedom. She voluntarily handed over the key to his exoneration. The howling wind whipped Harper's damp hair across her face. Silas stared at the microscopic chip in his palm. It was the culmination of a decade of blood, violence, and corporate warfare. It was his crown. It was his vengeance. And in that moment, it meant absolutely nothing compared to the woman shivering beside him. "You could have traded this to them," Silas said, his voice barely audible over the gale. "They would have let you walk away." "They murdered my mother," Harper replied, her dark eyes locking onto his. "And they framed you. I'm not walking away." The final, impenetrable wall of Silas's billionaire fortress crumbled into dust. For 10 years, he had built an empire on the premise of absolute control. He hoarded wealth and power to ensure he would never be helpless enough to watch an innocent die again. He thought the mating bond was a weakness, a biological chain that would leave him exposed. He reached out, his bloody fingers tracing the line of her jaw. She leaned into the touch, closing her eyes. The bond didn't feel like a chain anymore. It felt like an anchor. He pulled her into his lap, ignoring the searing pain in his thigh. She straddled his hips, burying her face in the crook of his neck. Silas wrapped his massive arms around her, crushing her against his chest. The smell of her wild honey, rain, and fierce, unyielding loyalty filled his lungs, fighting back the silver poison. "I bought you to settle a ledger," he whispered against her skin, the confession tearing from his throat. "But the second you stepped into my penthouse, you owned me. Every dollar, every drop of blood, it's yours." She lifted her head. Her lips met his in a bruising, desperate kiss. It wasn't the manipulative transaction of their first night. It was a raw, stripping surrender. Silas kissed her back with everything he had left, pouring his guilt, his obsession, and his fractured soul into the space between them. He wasn't an alpha king dominating a territory. He was just a man begging for the right to belong to her. The heavy, rhythmic thud of rotor blades vibrated through the steel girders. Silas broke the kiss, his wolf senses flaring to life. Adrenaline violently flushed the lethargy from his system. He looked out over the edge of the concrete slab. A black helicopter rose slowly from the smog, its sleek chassis completely devoid of Syndicate markers. His chest seized. It wasn't his extraction team. Before he could shout a warning, a blinding white spotlight ignited from the belly of the chopper, washing the 60th floor in daylight. The deafening roar of a heavy-caliber machine gun ripped through the air. Concrete exploded around them. "Get down!" Silas roared. He threw himself over Harper, using his broad back as a physical shield against the rain of shattered stone and hot lead. The gunfire chewed through the structural pillars, sending massive chunks of debris crashing to the floor. The council didn't care about recovering the drive anymore. They were executing a scorched earth protocol. The chopper circled, the gunner reloading for a second pass. Silas grabbed Harper by the harness of her torn uniform, dragging her behind the thickest elevator shaft core. His leg dragged uselessly behind him. They were pinned, there was no higher ground, and the stairwell was currently being chewed to dust by armor-piercing rounds. He looked at her. Her face was pale in the blinding spotlight, but her eyes were fiercely fixed on him. She wasn't running. A sharp metallic clink echoed over the wind. Silas's enhanced eyes tracked the small, cylindrical object bouncing across the concrete slab. It rolled to a stop just a few feet from their cover. A tactical concussion grenade. There was no time to throw it back. There was no time to run. Silas lunged, wrapping his body entirely around Harper to absorb the shockwave. The grenade detonated. The blast wave was a physical wall of force. It shattered Silas's eardrums and blew all the oxygen from his lungs. The impact threw them backward, like rag dolls, into the blinding, chaotic dust. His grip on Harper broke. The world dissolved into a ringing, violent white void. Ringing. A high, continuous pitch pierced his skull. Silas shoved a massive chunk of concrete off his chest. The dust was a thick, choking fog. He coughed, spitting black blood onto the pulverized floorboards. The silver poison in his thigh throbbed in time with his erratic heartbeat. "Harper?" he rasped. Silence. He dragged himself up. The mating bond, usually a burning, vibrant tether in his chest, was stretched paper-thin. It vibrated with a distant, sickening terror. She wasn't on the roof. The heavy crunch of tactical boots echoed through the dust cloud. 3 council sweepers emerged from the debris, their assault rifles equipped with thermal scopes. They had extracted her. They left the sweepers behind to finish him off. Silas didn't shift. He didn't need the wolf's claws. He became the exact monster they framed him to be. He lunged a shadow, tearing through the smoke. He grabbed the hot barrel of the first rifle, driving the heavy stock into the sweeper's visor with bone-crushing force. The second man fired. Silas took the graze to his ribs, closing the gap and twisting the man's neck until it snapped. The third dropped his weapon, turning to run. Silas caught him. He lifted the mercenary entirely off his feet by the throat. "Where did they take her?" he roared. The man choked, spitting blood. "High tribunal." Silas crushed his windpipe, dropping the lifeless body to the concrete. He stood alone in the ruins of the skyscraper. His billions, his power, his alpha supremacy. None of it had stopped them from taking the only thing in his life that actually mattered. He threw his head back. He unleashed a raw, apocalyptic howl into the smog. The penthouse was a pristine, mocking tomb. Silas kicked the shredded remains of his study door aside. He limped to his main server terminal, leaving a trail of bloody footprints across the imported marble floor. The silence of the luxury apartment was deafening. Just hours ago, she had stood in this very room, smelling of rain and fierce defiance. Now, the air was completely sterile, dead. He plugged the micro SD into the secure console. The files loaded immediately. The forensic proof, the offshore accounts of the council hitmen, the undeniable evidence that would clear his name and burn the High Council to ash. His bloody finger hovered over the Execute broadcast key. If he sent the files to the global shifter network, he would be a free man. The council would fall. Justice for Harper's mother would be absolute. Suddenly, the terminal screen flickered. An incoming encrypted audio transmission overrode the network. Silas slammed the accept key. Silas! The High Inquisitor's voice slithered through the speakers, smooth and dripping with arrogance. You look terrible. Silas glared at the glowing monitor. If you touch her, we already have, the Inquisitor interrupted. Your little human pet is currently chained in the holding cells of the tribunal arena. She's remarkably resilient, though she cries when she thinks no one is listening. Silas's claws extended, gouging deep trenches into the mahogany desk. A public execution is scheduled for dawn, the Inquisitor continued. A display of what happens to rogues who steal council property. Of course, we might be persuaded to offer a swift, painless end if you return the drive. The transmission cut to static. Dawn was 3 hours away. Silas stared at the glowing execute broadcast key. His entire life's work sat beneath his fingertip. He could press it. The news would break by sunrise. But bureaucratic justice moved slowly. The council would stall, deny, and execute Harper in the chaos, just out of spite. Releasing the data wouldn't save her beating heart. Does absolute control guarantee survival? He looked at his reflection in the dark monitor. He looked like a king who had built a fortress so high he trapped himself inside. He had hoarded power to never feel helpless again, yet here he was utterly paralyzed. Because true freedom demanded ultimate surrender. He pulled his hand away from the keyboard. The realization washed over him, cold and absolute. Justice wouldn't save her. Violence wouldn't save her. Only a trade would. Silas pulled out his secure burner phone. He didn't dial his syndicate lieutenants to organize a bloody siege. He didn't call the media. He dialed the High Inquisitor's private line. It rang twice. Have you decided to die a martyr, Silas? The Inquisitor sneered. I want a parley, Silas stated. His voice was completely devoid of emotion. It was the calm, chilling tone of a man who had already accepted his death. You have nothing to bargain with, except stolen property. I have my empire, Silas countered. My offshore accounts, the deeds to the inner-city territories, the loyalty of the underground pack. I will sign it all over to the High Council. I will publicly surrender my alpha status and walk to the execution block myself. A long, stunned silence echoed on the line. In exchange for what? Harper's absolute, irrevocable pardon. Silas gripped the edge of the desk. You let her walk out of the tribunal untouched, and you get the king. The blade of the combat knife dug deep into his ruined shoulder. Silas didn't flinch. He twisted the serrated steel, biting down on a leather belt until his jaw ached. Black blood spilled over his collarbone, hot and toxic. With a sickening pull, he popped the deformed silver bullet out of his flesh. It hit the marble floor with a dull, heavy clink. He moved to his thigh next. He repeated the brutal surgery, breathing through the blinding agony. Because of that toxic metal, his healing factor was severely delayed. The wounds would close, but he would be walking into the tribunal at a fraction of his strength. It didn't matter. He wasn't walking in as a warrior. He was walking in as a sacrifice. He tossed the bloody knife onto the desk. Standing on the other side of the mahogany wreckage was Marcus, his second in command. The hulking beta stared at the silver bullets on the floor, his scent radiating absolute horror and insubordination. You can't do this, Marcus growled, his hands braced on the desk. You're handing them the inner city, the ports, the offshore ledgers. They'll slaughter the underground pack the second you're dead. They won't, Silas replied calmly. He reached for a fresh roll of gauze, wrapping his shoulder tight. The transfer documents stipulate a hard boundary. The council gets my wealth and my head, provided the pack is granted total amnesty. And what about you? Silas tossed the encrypted micro SD onto the table. It slid to a stop against Marcus's knuckles. If Harper doesn't walk out of those doors alive, Silas commanded, his golden eyes locking onto his beta. You plug that drive into the global network. You burn the council to the ground. Marcus stared at the drive. You built this empire to be untouchable. You're giving them the keys to the kingdom for a human. In the stillness that followed, Silas pulled a clean, pressed white shirt from a garment bag. I'm giving them a cage. Silas corrected him softly, buttoning the shirt over the bloody bandages. She is the kingdom. The drive across the city was a quiet, surreal blur of neon and rain. Silas gripped the steering wheel of his black coupe. The leather groaned under the pressure of his tight knuckles. He wore his finest bespoke suit. There were no concealed blades, no tactical Kevlar. The dark fabric perfectly hid the black veins, still pulsing faintly up his neck. Beneath the moonlight breaking through the smog, the city he had ruled for a decade looked small. He had clawed his way up from the rogue gutters, hoarding billions, slaughtering rivals, and fortifying his heart with ice. He thought isolation was armor. He thought power was survival. Yet, as the massive glass dome of the tribunal arena loomed in the distance, he felt an overwhelming, profound peace. He closed his eyes at a red light. He focused on the frayed, distant edge of the mating bond. It was barely a hum in his chest, weakened by the distance and the silver, but it was there. He remembered the impossibly gentle slide of her fingers against his skin in that cheap motel bathroom. He remembered the smell of wild honey. Her bones remembered him. His soul answered. He didn't want to rule the city anymore. He just wanted to see her breathe. The light turned green. Silas pressed the accelerator, his injured leg screaming in protest. He welcomed the pain. It anchored him to the physical world. It kept the wolf focused. He pulled the coupe into the sprawling, heavily fortified courtyard of the tribunal arena. The lot was packed with luxury vehicles. The scent of 1,000 arrogant, high-born elites hung thick in the damp air. They had come to watch an execution. They were about to witness an abdication. The massive oak doors of the Colosseum entrance were flanked by elite council guards. Silas stepped out of the car. The rain had stopped, leaving a heavy, suffocating humidity in its wake. The guards immediately crossed their silver-tipped spears, blocking the threshold. Their eyes widened. They smelled the fresh blood beneath his cologne. They recognized the Alpha King. Weapons, the lead guard barked, his voice betraying a sliver of fear. Silas raised his hands, turning slowly. I am unarmed. I am here under the right of parley. The guards exchanged a nervous glance. Slowly, they lowered their spears. As the heavy doors groaned open, a wall of sound and scent hit Silas like a physical blow. The arena was a sprawling amphitheater of modern glass and ancient stone. Hundreds of Syndicate elites sat in the tiered seating, their voices a low, chaotic murmur. With every step he took down the central aisle, the whispers spread. It's him, the rogue billionaire. He's bleeding. Silas ignored them all. His golden eyes swept the vast, brightly lit floor of the arena. There, in the dead center of the Colosseum, was a heavy iron chair. His heart skipped. Harper was chained to it. Her uniform was torn. Her face was bruised and pale under the harsh stadium lights. But as Silas descended the final row of steps onto the arena floor, the air shifted. The moment their eyes locked, the mating bond flared into a violent, brilliant inferno in his chest. She gasped, pulling against the heavy iron cuffs. Her scent hit him a potent cocktail of fear, exhaustion, and sudden, desperate hope. She hadn't broken. She was still fighting. At the far end of the arena, the High Inquisitor sat on an elevated marble dais, sneering down at the floor. Ah! The Inquisitor's voice boomed over the stadium speakers, silencing the crowd. The king arrives. Ready to bend the knee? Silas didn't look at the Inquisitor. He kept his eyes completely locked on Harper. He walked until he stood directly between her and the dais, turning his broad back to the council's blade. I'm not here to bend the knee. Silas's voice echoed through the massive chamber, a low, rumbling threat that shook the glass. I'm here to break the board. The Inquisitor laughed. It was a dry, scraping sound echoing over the stadium speakers. Silas didn't blink. He pulled a thick sheaf of legal vellum from his inner jacket pocket. He didn't come to beg. He came to execute a transaction. The right of absolute surrender. Silas projected his voice, letting the deep alpha timbre bleed into the acoustics. The arena went dead silent. I, Silas, king of the inner city, forfeit all territorial claims. I forfeit my offshore ledgers, my port authorities, and my pack leadership. I surrender my alpha status to the High Council. He dropped the heavy documents onto the blood-stained sand of the arena floor. As the silence stretched, the Inquisitor leaned forward. Greed radiated from the dais, thick and sour. The council had hunted him for a decade, and now he was handing them the keys to the city. The terms? An absolute, irrevocable pardon for the human Harper, Silas stated. He didn't look at the Inquisitor. He kept his eyes locked on her bruised face. Her debts erased, her bounty cleared. She walks out of those doors untouched. The Inquisitor sneered. Done. You are stripped of your crown, rogue. Release the girl. Guards stepped forward, turning heavy iron keys. The chains hit the floor with a deafening clatter. Silas let out a slow, ragged breath. He had done it. She was safe. He lowered his arms, preparing his exhausted body for the inevitable swarm of executioners. Run along to your grease trap, little bird, the Inquisitor mocked from on high. The rogue is ours to hunt now. Silas waited for her to run. He wanted her to run. He needed her to survive. Instead, she didn't step toward the exit. She walked directly toward him. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted. Harper stopped inches from his chest. She reached down, picking up a jagged shard of broken glass from a shattered stadium light on the floor. Without hesitation, she dragged the sharp edge across her palm. Fresh, hot blood welled up. The scent of wild honey and copper hit Silas like a freight train. Between them, something cracked. The terrified waitress was gone. The survivor remained, feral and resolute. She slammed her bleeding palm flat against the center of his chest, right over his heart. By the ancient laws of this territory, Harper shouted, her voice ringing clear and fierce into the rafters, I, a free and pardoned citizen, claim this rogue as my mated alpha. His blood is mine. His life is mine. The entire Colosseum froze. Silas stared down at her. The mating bond, previously a frayed and battered thread, completely erupted. It locked into place with the force of a dying star going supernova. His injuries, the silver poison, the sheer exhaustion it was, all washed away in a tidal wave of absolute, terrifying power. He wasn't a king anymore, but he was hers. The Inquisitor shot to his feet. Treason! Law! Silas roared back, his voice shaking the foundation of the arena. A claimed rogue falls under the legal protection of their mate. You pardoned her. She claimed me. I am untouchable by the High Council. The logic trapped the elites in their own ancient bureaucracy. Murmurs of outrage exploded across the tiered seating, but the guards did not move. They couldn't. To strike a claimed mate was to declare war on the very laws that gave the council its power. In the stillness that followed, Silas wrapped his large hand over hers, holding her bloody palm tight against his chest. They turned around. They walked back down the central aisle. The sea of heavily armed elites parted for them, their scents bitter with fury and defeat. Silas didn't look back. They stepped out of the heavy oak doors and into the cool, damp night air. Equals. 6 months later, Silas stood in the kitchen of a small, sunlit apartment far from the inner city. He wore a plain gray t-shirt. His hands were covered in flour, not blood. He looked across the room. Harper was laughing, stacking dishes near the sink of the underground safe house they now operated for escaping Omegas. The smell of fresh coffee and rain drifted through the open window, mixing with the permanent, intoxicating scent of his mate. By the time the afternoon sun hit the floorboards, Silas felt a deep, settling peace. He had lost an empire. He had surrendered his billions and his crown. Because of that, he had finally found his freedom.